Welcome to Resource on the Go, a podcast from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center on understanding, responding to, and preventing sexual abuse and assault. I'm Sally Laskey, NSVRC's Evaluation Coordinator. This is part 2 of our series on economic supports. On today's episode, I talk with Shayne Spaulding. Shayne is a senior fellow in the Work, Education, and Labor Division at the Urban Institute, where her work focuses on workforce development, post-secondary education, and employment. She has spent more than 25 years in the workforce field as an evaluator, technical assistance provider, and program manager. Our conversation focuses on the evidence on employment-focused strategies that can improve outcomes for youth. Welcome to Resource on the Go, Shayne.
Hi, so glad to be here.
I shared a bit about you in our intro to the podcast, but what else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, I'd love them to know that I've been in the workforce field really for my whole career, but I've been in different vantage points. So I've been inside a huge higher education system. I worked at the City University of New York. I also have provided technical assistance and capacity building to nonprofits and other education and training providers. And I've been in the research field for quite a while. And so what this means is that in my research, I really try to connect research to practice so that we're conducting research on things that are useful to people so that they can take action and make changes. So that is an important part about my background.
Well, we are so lucky that we connected with you. Over the last year, our sexual violence in the workplace content has been the most viewed and downloaded. With the wide need and interest in workplaces and with a focus around economic justice, I am looking at our podcast series to do some interviews focusing on economic supports as a protective factor against sexual violence. I came across a brief this summer on helping youth to thrive in the workplace, and I've asked you here to share what employment-focused strategies have been identified, specifically as promising and effective approaches for improving the outcomes for youth. With your background and experience and with this specific brief, could you start us off by sharing what we know about this generation of young people and what they bring to the workplace?
Sure. So it's always hard to characterize a whole generation of people. Obviously, they are not one thing, but we know that this generation is a really diverse group of people. And so I think that's what this means is thinking about ways to make workplaces more inclusive for this new generation as we're trying to attract that workforce. We know that this generation has grown up with technology, so sometimes they'll be called digital natives. And I think sometimes we think that means that they're just fluent at the technology in every context, but really, I think young people need support in how to use technology in the workplace. What you do in social media or on your phone might not translate exactly, but they also bring a set of skills and comfort that I think is important to acknowledge. Young people in this generation suffered a lot during the pandemic because of the shift to online learning and all the disruption that happened in their lives. And I think, that's something that, they bring with them. I think it makes them probably resilient and have grit in a lot of ways, but also they had those kinds of challenges that we can provide support for as they enter the workplace. And then I think surveys show that young people in this generation have some expectations about work around flexibility and balance. They also may feel less attached to particular employers. And so keeping that in mind, it's like, how can we keep them in here? How can we make sure that they're retained in their jobs and they thrive in the workplace? And so those are some of the things we explored in our paper. I will just say one other thing is
Yeah.
that since this paper was written, we've heard a lot about the rise in AI.
Yeah.
And that was not something we focused a lot on, but we know this is creating new challenges for entry-level workers, a lot of anxieties. I have a freshman, my son is a freshman in college, and he worries a lot about what the jobs will look like when he graduates. And so I think this is something that this next generation will be contending with.
Yeah, you really encapsulated what I'm hearing from the young people in my life for sure. So let's get into some of the findings. The brief, there were several promising approaches that were identified. What did you find will increase access to employment for youth?
Yeah, so half of the paper really focused on the skill development side. So all the things that young people need to prepare for jobs. And we have a lot of evidence in this area on what works to support young people in developing skills. Things like making sure that programs are designed in partnership with employers so people are learning the right skills, and the value of work-based learning, paid work-based learning, so people can earn skills in a work context and earn income at the same time. We also know about the importance of integrating academic and occupational skills when people are in college or in other kinds of training programs. And then the importance of providing counseling and support. So those are all the things that happen before, right? Before a young
Mhm.
person is going into the workplace. But I think then it's really important to think about the access side. So, how do people access jobs? And we have less specific evidence in this space about what works for young workers, but I think there are a few things that we can point to here. One, I think, is we know that there's discrimination in hiring for people who are people of color, for women. There's a lot of evidence on this. And so, thinking about the ways to guard against that, some people have thought that algorithmic hiring or AI-based hiring is one way. And so that's, one way to screen people as they're coming into jobs. But we also know can be a lot of bias built into those algorithms. And so really paying attention to how those biases are reflected in the hiring process. I think also, employers can take stock of their hiring processes to make sure that people are getting a fair chance as they're entering the workplace. So they can audit their hiring practices just to make sure that they are really able to access that talent, right, as people are entering the workplace. And then I think from a public policy perspective, we know that because we know about this discrimination, it's really important that existing laws are enforced. Unfortunately, there's been quite a backlog on enforcement due to underfunding and various other issues, but really keeping the attention on enforcing existing laws is important for ensuring access for workers.
It might be helpful for me to do a check-in. A lot of our listeners working in the anti-violence field are working in nonprofit spaces or government entities. Are there any specific recommendations for those types of workplaces?
We didn't have specific recommendations for those types of workplaces, but I would just say, for any employer, it's important to, you know, think about how you're just posting jobs and where those jobs are made accessible. Sometimes if you're trying to reach diverse talent, it's important to go outside the normal like hiring processes or hiring networks. Employers can build relationships with those kinds of community-based organizations. So one way to really access talent is through those ongoing relationships. And it gives you a chance to get to know some of the young people that might be coming up through a training program or completing a training program. Um, and then I think the kinds of supports that workers receive once they're on the job are important. I can talk a little bit more about that, but those are the
Yeah.
kinds of things that make people want to stay on the job.
Oh, yes. Let's please dive into the retention issue, especially for young workers.
Yeah, so we all know, many of us have been there, when often people get promoted within the workplace. they're moved up and they don't get much training on how to be a supervisor. And so one of the things that I think can be really important for supporting young workers is just training supervisors in how to best support incoming talent. So how to be a good supervisor. And so I think that is one step that employers can take. There's a lot of evidence on the importance of mentorship for young people as they're making their way to adulthood. And so this can kind of take place in the workplace as well. And there are many different businesses that have in place in mentorship programs, and that could be one way of supporting young workers. Young workers might, like all workers, have a lot of other needs, right, outside of the workplace. And so trying to support those needs in various ways. Often employee assistance programs can be available, and that can help young people with mental health counseling or confidential advising that can be important, or helping to access other resources in the community that can help them. There's evidence that one of the things that can be important for retention is actually providing training for advancement, so giving people the opportunity to move up in the workplace and also making visible the pathways that exist. So what are the opportunities to move up once you enter a new job? How can you increase your income? How can you move up to the next level? What are the steps that you need to take? So that's important. And training can be provided by employers directly, or they can work in partnership with colleges or other training providers to offer that training. And I think, as I noted earlier, surveys of workers show that young workers are less attached to individual employers. So, they're a little more likely to jump ship. And so thinking about the things that will keep them there. So in addition to good supervision and training, it's thinking about things like providing good wages and benefits that can ensure stability. And all these things together can help to retain young workers.
It's really in line with a lot of work happening within the rape prevention education program as we've been looking at economic factors. There are programs around the country that have been looking at pay equity and workplace policies, including family leave, and also looking at hiring policies. We've actually even had those discussions about supports within organizations, especially for new prevention workers coming in, and done some training for supervisors. So I'm glad that we're kind of in line with what you are saying are some evidence-based practices. So knowing like what's happening in our field in this work around economic factors that increase risk for sexual violence, abuse, and harassment, how do you think this research can support and inform all of us that are working with business and policy leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, I would just start by saying that young workers often or report more problems at work than older workers. In various surveys, they've found that young workers are more likely to be subject to unwanted verbal abuse and sexual advances or harassment on the job site. And this may be partly because often young workers are more likely to work or have predominance in the retail and service sectors where there's high risk of violence, harassment, and mistreatment. And so thinking about like what are the strategies to help prevent that workplace violence is really important, I think. And I think there's room, as I said, for increasing enforcement actions to protect workers on the job, and then to look at those particular sectors to see what kinds of changes might be needed to support those workers. There's room to educate employers about these risks for workers and the risks for young workers in particular, and think about what steps they can take to mitigate the harms. And then finally, to educate workers themselves in these industries or young workers in general about their rights and what they can do to protect themselves. So, making sure that young workers have the supports that they need to navigate some of these challenges at work.
Fabulous. Well, I think a lot of our listeners are in those spaces around providing information about rights and supports. There are some great connections we can be making. Is there additional research or are there tools or resources that you would point our listeners to learn more about this area?
Yeah, sure. So, in addition to our longer report, for those of you who don't have a lot of time, we actually produced three shorter briefs in connection to the longer report. And one is just really an action-based summary. And then we have one brief that's for policymakers and one that's focused on employers. So these might be helpful to your listeners. We also have some other work coming out this spring that's looking at different approaches to supporting young workers. One body of research I think people might be interested in is focused on helping young workers access jobs related to the infrastructure, so in water and energy efficiency and other things related to our urban infrastructure. And that can provide, those jobs provide a lot of opportunity for quality jobs, and some of those jobs are really considered more AI proof. And so I think a lot of opportunities to support workers in entering those fields.
Well, I'm really excited for the upcoming resources you have coming out. We'll make sure that we provide some more specific links and information for our listeners in our show notes. I am so thankful for you sharing this information and joining us today. We're really grateful for your work and the work of the Urban Institute. So I appreciate you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Resource on the Go. For more resources and information about preventing sexual assault, visit our website at www.nsvrc.org. And please come back for our part 3 in this series. Any questions or help accessing information on this topic, contact us by emailing resources at nsvrc-respecttogether.org.